In the 1950s, Alice and Jack live an idyllic life in a typical American town. They enjoy spending time with friends, driving around, and sharing a deep love for each other. One day, as Alice prepares for a party with friends, Jack heads to work along with a group of other white-collar workers. A female narrator mentions that today marks the 997th day. In a class for exemplary wives, the instructor, Shelley, emphasizes that beauty lies in control and grace in symmetry. After the class, Alice returns home and chats with her neighbor, Bonnie, who frequently scolds her children. Alice then heads out to take down the dried laundry. A catchy tune plays in her head, and she hums it while noticing another neighbor, Margaret, standing in front of her house, seemingly lost in thought. As Alice begins cooking, she becomes suspicious of an egg, which turns out to be empty when she squeezes it. She crushes the remaining eggs, finding them all hollow, before being interrupted by the smell of burnt meat. In the evening, she greets Jack, beautifully dressed, and with a set table, but he prefers to start with a more intimate activity. The next day, while the women relax by the pool, Alice is distracted by the song in her head. She then experiences a visual sequence of a circle of women in wigs. Later, Alice approaches a model of the town, tracing her finger along the streets mindlessly. When she reaches the town limits, Bonnie picks her up, signaling it's time for cocktails served by her children. Meanwhile, the men engage in seemingly trivial discussions. A signal sounds, and Shelley welcomes new residents, expressing her happiness that the couple can learn from her husband, Frank, who has created something extraordinary, a new world. Margaret interrupts Shelley's speech, stating that she and her husband don't belong there. Alice's husband quickly leads her away, and Frank apologizes to the guests, explaining that the couple is going through a tough time, tasked with chasing dreams and confronting chaos, the main enemy of progress. The guests echo Frank's sentiments, agreeing that they are all one happy family. Later, Alice goes to find Jack but encounters Margaret, who confides that she has nightmares and feels out of place. Before Alice can learn more, her husband intervenes. Back home, Jack kisses Alice, and they share an intimate moment, but Alice is disturbed when she sees Frank watching them with a smile. The next day, the women gather at a shopping center, discussing their perfect lives and poor Margaret. Alice feels sympathy for her neighbor, while Bonnie believes Margaret brought trouble upon herself by taking her son into the desert alone, only to be found without the child. The conversation shifts to what the men are doing. No one knows for sure, but there are rumors that they are making weapons. Bonnie interjects, saying that's not their business. Women also work by creating comfort at home. That night, Alice has a nightmare, but in the morning, she sends her husband off to work as usual and starts her household chores. Later, she goes on a trip, being the only passenger left on the trolley bus. She tells the driver she just wants to ride. Suddenly, she sees a plane flying toward the mountains and then crashing. Alice yells at the driver, urging him to help the victims, but he doesn't understand her urgency and insists he cannot deviate from his route. Determined, Alice jumps off the trolley bus and runs toward the mountains. She treks a long way through the desert, reaches a road, and climbs a high mountain topped by a strange dome. As she gets closer, she encounters a mirrored glass. Seeing only her reflection, Alice raises her hands to the glass and loses consciousness. In the darkness, she sees a circle of dancing women and hears a male voice calling for order, urging people to discover what life should be like. The next moment, Alice finds herself back in her bed. When she goes to the kitchen, she sees Jack preparing dinner amidst disarray and spoiled groceries. Confused, Alice asks what happened, and Jack explains that she was already asleep when he returned from work, and she came back on the trolley bus. Alice questions whether the driver came back for her, but Jack looks at her with incomprehension. Alice decides she must have dreamt the whole experience. The next morning, everything seems normal. Alice sends her husband off and begins cleaning the window glass, but suddenly it appears to move, pressing her against the wall. She gasps for air, overwhelmed by the inexplicable event. The next moment, the phone rings, freeing Alice from the strange pressure. Margaret's voice on the other end urges her to leave immediately, reminding her that she saw everything herself. Alice once again sees the dancing women, but now it's herself and her friends. Suddenly, instead of her own reflection, Margaret appears, banging her head against the mirror. Alice screams and wakes up, running home to find Margaret on the roof of her house. Margaret turns to Alice, cuts her own throat, and falls. Alice screams in horror as employees arrive to take Margaret's body away. In the evening, Alice tries to explain what happened to Jack, but he doesn't believe her. He tells her Margaret is in the hospital after accidentally cutting herself while washing windows. Alice feels guilty because Margaret had asked for help. Desperate for answers, Alice asks Jack about his work, but he cannot discuss it. He urges her to stop being hysterical, warning it could ruin everything. That night, Alice watches a commercial for their town and feels trapped, like she's floundering in a pool with no escape. The next morning, as she cooks, she starts wrapping her head with cling film, seemingly trying to bring herself to her senses. When the suffocation doesn't help, she tears off the film. The arriving doctor assures her that she's just under nervous strain from witnessing Margaret's fall. Despite Alice's insistence that Margaret slit her own throat, the doctor suggests prescribing pills, but Jack refuses, saying they can handle it. The doctor assures them that Margaret will soon recover and return home, then leaves, forgetting his briefcase. Alice manages to pull out a folder with Margaret's personal file, but the text is smeared and unreadable. Frustrated, Alice burns the folder, drinks alcohol, and once again sees the dancing women. Later, Alice finds herself in the bathroom. Jack, unhappy about their lateness, brings her a dress and suggests they think about having a child. He promises they have a wonderful evening ahead. The couple arrives at a restaurant where all the town's residents are gathered. A glamorous blonde performs for the audience, and Alice again sees the circle of women and Margaret's suicide. Feeling ill, Alice's distress goes unnoticed by those around her. Frank gives a speech and invites Jack on stage, congratulating him for entering the Senior Expert Council. Frank presents Jack with a loyalty token, a ring, and the audience applauds as Jack performs a dance of gratitude. Unable to watch, Alice runs to the bathroom and has a vision of another Jack who has lost his job. Perplexed, Bonnie finds her and interrupts Alice's attempt to explain. Bonnie accuses Alice of behaving like a spoiled child and ruining Jack's career, comparing her to Margaret. Returning to the hall, Alice watches Jack's triumph and tries to restrain herself. In the morning, Jack reminds Alice that they will have guests in the evening, and she needs to express gratitude to Frank. Alice greets the guest with a smile, maintaining the perfect facade. While her husband meets Frank, Alice finishes preparing the appetizers. Frank enters the kitchen and starts talking to Alice, expressing regret that Bonnie didn't believe her, just as she hadn't believed Margaret. He reveals he's been waiting for someone to challenge him. As the guests sit down at the table, Alice demonstratively takes the host's seat and Jack complies, sitting next to her. The conversation drifts aimlessly until Alice disrupts it by questioning why all the women in town are from just 1 or 2 states and vacation in the same places. Jack tries to change the topic, but Alice persists, pointing out that they all met their husbands on trains under similar circumstances and have identical stories because they are told what to remember. She accuses Frank of manipulating them. Frank, smirking, reminds Alice of her nervous breakdown and questions why she isn't getting treated and why she was at the headquarters. Jack is horrified to learn she was at the headquarters. Frank continues, claiming she broke the rules and that her behavior is the result of psychosis, adding that she revealed herself to him in his bedroom. Alice is stunned by the lie, but Jack believes Frank unconditionally. Desperate, Alice tries to appeal to the guests' common sense, questioning where the products come from and what's in them. Shelley, however, stands up and defends her husband, refusing to let him be insulted. The guests leave, disappointed. Frank expresses his dissatisfaction, having expected something more interesting from Alice. After seeing everyone out, Jack returns to the house. Alice pleads with him, expressing that he is the most precious person to her and asking to leave together, anywhere. Jack agrees, and they leave the house and get into the car. Just as Jack apologizes to Alice, employees pull her out of the car and drag her into the darkness. Alice finds herself on an operating table, with visions of her husband passing by. A masked doctor leans over her, and she recognizes herself. The next moment, Doctor. Alice finishes the operation and goes home, where her unemployed husband meets her. He hasn't prepared dinner because he didn't know what she would want, and there's no hot water. Alice, exhausted from standing at the operating table for 30 hours, denies her husband intimacy. He sits at a monitor, listening to an advertisement for a new simulation. Once again, it's a sunny morning in Paradise Town. Alice returns to her surroundings, greeted enthusiastically by Bonnie, who shares the latest news. Alice hugs her children, not noticing her friend's worried look. Her husband goes to work, and Alice continues her household chores, dancing and swimming, before reuniting with her husband. She takes the roast out of the oven while Jack selects a record, humming a tune that jolts Alice awake. Jack walks through the dark city and enters his apartment. His physical characteristics are narrated, emphasizing that he is perfectly suited for the Victory Project and takes on the responsibility of maintaining Alice's vital functions. Alice envisions herself in bed, restrained and entangled with wires. Jack tends to her physical body, because he is obligated to exit the simulation daily to work and afford their simulated life. Jack lies down next to her and hums the song that Alice hears. She realizes that he has deprived her of real life, but he did this to save her from constant work. Frank created this world so they could live as they wished, with Jack working tirelessly to sustain it. Although Jack believes she is happy, Alice questions what this means for the others, realizing they are essentially hostages. When Jack tries to console her, Alice strikes him on the head. Bonnie finds Alice next to Jack's lifeless body and immediately informs Frank. Bonnie confesses that she knows everything about the simulation but chose this life because she can be with her children, who are alive in this world. However, she reveals that the other women are unaware and urges Alice to run or face death. Alice steps into the yard, gets into Jack's car, and drives into the desert with employees in pursuit. During the chase, Alice maneuvers sharply, causing a collision that kills a doctor, but her pursuers continue. Frank is informed and orders Alice's capture at all costs. Meanwhile, Shelley stabs Frank, calling him a fool who has ruined everything. Alice races towards the mountain, but near the summit, her car stalls. She continues on foot, with employees close behind. As she reaches the dome, she feels Jack's hands on her shoulders, begging her not to leave him. Shelley reaches out, and darkness ensues. Visions of the perfect life and victory flash before Alice as she awakens in reality. This scenario presents a moral dilemma. Jack deprived Alice of reality with the intention of making her happy, an escape from everyday problems that many might desire. However, the question remains whether true happiness can be achieved against someone's will.